It is a great privilege to welcome our guest speakers today, David P. Goldman, Deputy Editor of the Asia Times and Fellow of the Corvinus Institute of Advanced Studies. And Philip Pilkington, a macroeconomist and a senior researcher of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and a host of the Multipolarity podcast. So, gentlemen, the title of our discussion today is Who is Rewriting Global Rules? Grand Strategies for Great Powers. In order to trigger our discussion, I brought with myself one of the more recent editions of The Economist, the cover page of which features a visibly wounded and heavily bandaged American bald eagle, with the title, Only 1,361 Days Left. Obviously, the title refers to the prospective end of the Trump administration, and besides the usual Trump derangement syndrome, it also refers to some sort of lingering yearning of the editorial board and the liberal elites represented by them for the return of some sort of a belle epoque of liberal globalist rule. Whereas I would say that many people in this room would argue that what we are witnessing in earnest is a global shift of wealth and power in historic proportions. And my first question pertains to this historic part. Do you think what we are witnessing has any precedent in history, or this is something completely unknown and we're in uncharted waters in this regard? David?
There's one aspect of the present situation, maybe a critical aspect, which really has no precedent. With a couple of exceptions, the working age population of every major country in the world is shrinking. This has profound effects for international relations. World War I, the rapid expansion of the Serbian population was the impulse for the confrontation between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. Russia's current adult population is 88 millions. By the end of the century, it will be 48 millions. There's no example I know of a country with a rapidly shrinking working age population going to war for Lebensraum. So the idea that Russia plans to conquer the rest of Europe, in my view, is simply absurd. But this has important implications for everyone. Countries with aging populations need to save for retirement, which means they're supposed to run current account surpluses. They're supposed to export more than they import and save the difference. Everyone can't do that simultaneously. The Chinese have the biggest program of export of capital in world history. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. They have a shrinking population. Their objective is to harness the labor of the rest of the world, particularly the global south, in order to deal with their aging problem. The United States, until just now, has been the dump for demand for the rest of the world. We've run $1 trillion trade deficit. We've been buying everyone else's product, enabling everyone else to save. We have been dissaving, as a result of which we have a massive internal debt, a massive net foreign asset deficit, about $25 trillion of foreign-owned assets. And we will have a financial crisis, just as the Trump administration has warned. So we have to stop. There's no choice about it. The United States cannot continue providing demand for the rest of the world. And this transformation is the cause of the current upset in international trade relations. So it is really unprecedented, in my view, and working this out in a way that avoids major disruption will take considerable caution and intelligence. The potential for disruption is there, but it's by no means inevitable.
Philip?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really worth highlighting what David just said. The crunch moment that we're seeing now was inevitable. It had to happen. America's been sending paper dollars to the rest of the world in exchange for goods and services for, I mean, since the 70s really, but in its current phase, since the early 2000s, when China started to rise. And you can't run up that much debt forever. The world has only a certain amount of capacity to absorb surplus dollars, and that capacity was running out anyway. I think it started with the financial crisis of 2008, and really when it went bonkers in a sense was after the seizure of the Russian reserve assets, massively undermined confidence in the dollar. And then Liberation Day, as it's been called in America, has just kind of accelerated that process. We said before when we were talking, and the Economist article is really ironic. I said, where were they during the Biden administration? These trends were set in motion, or they were turbocharged by the Biden administration's decision, especially around the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia and China coming closer. So I think ultimately what that Economist cover signals is that the liberal globalists, if you want to call them that, are blaming the collapse of the global order that they created and then precipitated the collapse, and they're looking for a scapegoat to blame it on, and the Trump administration is the scapegoat. In terms of how large a shift this is, I don't even know where to go back. I mean, in terms of the economic turmoil that it'll probably unleash and the geopolitical turmoil, we're probably talking about the interwar years between World War I and World War II, when there's an awful lot of disorder that then eventually gets put back in some sort of order in 1945, 1946 with the Bretton Woods arrangement and so on. I'm not saying that we're going to have World War III. I don't think we will, actually. I think Ukraine was the most dangerous thing that we'll see in this transition, and thankfully that's calmed down a little bit. So I'm not saying that, but I do think the levels of economic turmoil will be probably similar to the interwar period, and they'll probably be accelerated. They'll probably be compressed in a much smaller portion of time. But I think in terms of civilizational impact, the interwar period was effectively the transition away from a British-led world to an American-led world. The British effectively were passing the baton to the Americans, sometimes willingly, I think, and sometimes not so willingly. I always highlight that Churchill's mother was actually American. Interesting historical tidbit that you can think about maybe after the discussion. But they were passing the baton to the Americans, and then the American world order solidified in 1945, 1946 after the war. Of course, what we're seeing now is the rise of a civilizational moment that has nothing to do with what you might call Anglo-liberalism, which is what the transition from the British to the American imperial systems meant. So in that sense, I think you have to go way back to the collapse of China civilizationally in the 19th century and so on. And it's very hard to draw analogies because back then it was a very different world to today. So huge changes, yeah. And I think simplifying them like The Economist is doing it's not only disingenuous, it's just really like sub-intellectual. It's really stupid, I think.
So there's a theory in international relations introduced by Graham Allison about roughly a decade ago called the Thucydides trap, which basically says that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the resulting global stress makes a collision more of a rule than an exception. Do you think this is the case now between America and China? I have two questions or sub-questions in this regard. How do you evaluate the first 100 days of the Trump administration in this regard? Does the Trump administration have a sort of master strategy, or it's rather a coercion course that they must follow? And a second is there going to be a trade war or a shooting war between US and China? I think Philip partly answered that second question.
Allison's book has many virtues, but the Thucydides trap has, I think, one major flaw as a thesis. Athens was a city, half of whose population were slaves, and it depended upon the tribute from the Delian League for its economy. Sparta was a military society whose citizens trained for war and lived off the work of the helots, the slave populations of adjacent countries. both of them were extremely vulnerable to destabilization by the other because they were parasitic societies economically. Neither the United States nor China is inherently parasitic. We're not slave societies. China produces 80% of its energy, enough calories to feed its population without imports. It's not dependent on the loot of empire by any means. Its exports are a substantial portion of GDP, but its exports to the United States are only 2% of GDP. And in the extreme case that there were a complete decoupling, China's economy would survive with lower growth rates, but would not collapse by any means. The United States has let its manufacturing industry atrophy, and that's a grave failure, but it's not a permanent failure. It's certainly something that we can correct. The Chinese, moreover, have a very different imperial system. They assimilate and absorb people within their geographic borders, but China has never in its history shown an interest in governing other peoples. To the extent that I've gotten to know Chinese officials over the years, I think they really don't care at all how we barbarians manage our affairs. They think they're a superior system. They don't want to impose their system on us because they don't think we're clever enough to do it their way. And from Trump's standpoint, America First means we do not care how you manage your affairs. Do whatever you want. We wish you well. If we can help, we will. We're well disposed towards you, but we're really not interested in how you run Hungary or anybody else. So I think the Thucydides trap thesis, though it has many virtues, misses some of the fundamentals.
Yeah, I think it is a kind of case of false determinism in a sense. There's no reason that mechanically, because there's a ruling power in place and another power is coming up, that it ends in conflict. And even drawing analogies from history like that, when now we have completely different weapon systems, we have nuclear weapons and so on, it seems kind of misguided to me. But look, the version of the argument that ends up with a trade war, well, we're a couple of weeks now from Liberation Day, so I don't know if that was predetermined, written in the stars, as it were, but it certainly happened. And I think that speaks to the second part of your question, which is what is the strategy here of the Trump administration? I can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure I know what happened with the trade war from having asked around and watched it very closely. I think basically what happened was America realized, people in the Trump movement, and I even think some people on the Democrat side realized that, as we said at the beginning here, the current system was no longer sustainable, and that if something wasn't done to try and manage the transition from it, there would be a chaotic transition, inevitably. And I think a lot of brain power was put into trying to think through how to do that. I think the two key figures in the Trump administration here are the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and Stephen Moran, who you may not have heard of, but he's the head of the Council of Economic Affairs. And he put together a very comprehensive document that was released in January about how to try and manage this transition. I won't go into it. You could give an hour lecture on what it was, but the point is that there was an awful lot of thought put into it. But I think that there was a little bit of, nobody really knew how to go about actioning it. And I think basically what happened was Trump became very close to Peter Navarro, because Navarro actually went to jail for Trump, long political story behind that. And he went with his instinct and was pushed on by Navarro to do a massive tariff package, which is what we saw on Liberation Day. And now the basic mode that the US government is in is to try and manage the chaos that's created. I think something had to be done. I think they were right to try and take the bull by the horns, as we say in English. I think they were correct to do that. But I think now they're starting to wake up to the dependencies on the Chinese economy. I think that Trump is a tariffs guy, but he's a tariffs guy from the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the United States was not nearly as as reliant as they currently are, especially on China for many of these key goods and services. You've probably seen these magnets and rare earths and so on in the headlines recently. So I think right now there's a process of awakening to the realities of those trade dependencies going on in DC, and we'll see what comes of it.
Let's have a look at one particular sector or area, because of course it's a commonplace or a platitude to say that technology is going to be the new frontier where history may be decided. And on this particular subject, in particular, I turn to you, David. In one of your books a couple of years ago, you stated that unless the US takes innovation seriously, the rest of the world will be assimilated into a virtual empire controlled by Chinese technology.
Well, there are 7 billion people in the global south who are much poorer than we are. And the human potential there is enormous. Artificial intelligence and related technologies have an incredible potential to transform that part of the world. For example, digital technology. We find that the moment you get about a 60% penetration rate of mobile broadband, there's an explosion of business creation, because people who are in a barter economy, trading items within a village or a very small area, suddenly can get customers and information from around the world. There are many other examples of how new technologies affect the rest of the world. And China has had a plan for digitizing and building infrastructure in the global south for 15 years. I saw this firsthand with companies like Huawei in China when I worked in Hong Kong as an investment banker some years ago. We don't have a plan, and that worries me. If China becomes the dominant supplier of technology to the majority of the world, and the United States and Europe remain in the sidelines, then yes, China's economic reach will incorporate the majority of the world population, and China will be the dominant economic power. I don't particularly like that idea. I think that the Hungarian government has been very forward-looking in this respect by its emphasis on Central Asia. If you include Central Asia and the global south, it's interesting because it's the only part of the world where you have both a rapidly expanding working age population and an educated population. So it's a very important human resource, and Turkey's role in this is important. Hungary, as you know, is the only member of the Organization of Turkic States and has been something of a trailblazer. So I think that's the kind of forward-looking thinking that the West needs, and Hungary has set a very useful example.
Would you like to comment on the technology part?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think what David said is correct, but I'd just highlight one other trend which is related to this. You may have seen DeepSeek, this Chinese AI program, flashed into the headlines and then flashed out. It flashed out due to a massive public relations campaign, actually, by American companies, because this thing was so disruptive. The key thing to understand about the DeepSeek thing, well, first of all, obviously it says that the Chinese coders, as it were, can easily beat the American Silicon Valley coders now. So in terms of software, the Chinese are probably now competitive, probably have been for a while. But the real thing to understand is that it's an open source system. And my sense is that the Chinese are actually moving to make kind of what used to be called freeware for everyone, that the software they don't actually care that much about. Just put it out. Don't put any kind of gateways on it, no kind of IP construction, whatever, and then we'll beat you on the industrial thing. Now, this is a huge problem because over the last 20 years especially, the United States and some European countries, I'm thinking Britain and so on, have become addicted to intellectual property protection, which we could have a whole debate about IP, but ultimately it is, from an economic perspective, it's an entrenched monopoly, right, if you're given this. If the Chinese are saying, and they've done this in the past with generic drugs and so on, if they come in and they say, we don't care about IP, we're not going to charge, we're going to put out software, for example, like Microsoft Office, that doesn't charge you a monthly subscription fee because we think that we can compete on the hardware. that's a whole different game. I think it's a huge threat to what's left of the American Silicon Valley model, actually.
So far, we've been talking about US and China, but there are, of course, other major players here. And I'd like to ask you about this dimension. So can we boil down the emerging global order to a G2 US-China rivalry? Because there are lots of evidence to the contrary. In the last few days, two nuclear powers on the Indian subcontinent were on the brink of a full-blown war. The war is still going on in Ukraine. And to give you an idea, or to give you a hint of one level down, a strong middle power, Turkey, has made significant inroads in Syria, is a major rival of Russia in the Caucasus. So it seems as if these middle powers are making use of their increased room for maneuver and basically take care of their own interests without the old masters, since the old master is away. Philip?
Yeah, no, I think what we're seeing with the development of what's being called a multipolar world is a snapback to civilizational norms. What's going on in Syria with the Turks, for example, looks very like a neo-Ottoman empire, right? So why wouldn't we assume that these kind of old civilizational norms will kick back in? It seems completely logical. It'll probably be that historians look back on the period between World War I, which obviously has a very deep meaning for Hungary, the period between World War I and today, those 100 years, as being an anomaly. It was a sort of an Anglo-imperialist moment. I mean, there's nothing else really to call it. I know you can sound like a Marxist or something if you say that, but it is the reality. And that moment kind of interfered with the normal civilizational development of the world, which included China, Turkey, all these other powers. Latin America is a more difficult one, obviously. I don't think we're getting the Aztecs back, let's just put it that way. But in terms of the real long-standing civilizational powers, Turkey, India, China, and so on, and Europe, that's the whole different question. I think assuming that you just revert back to those civilizational norms is a pretty good base case assumption in a multipolar world.
I see the Turkish issue a bit differently. Turkey has one major shortage, and that's Turks. If you look at the 2020 census data, province by province, the most ethnically Turkish provinces have a total fertility rate 1.2 or 1.3 at the level of Spain or Italy. The Kurdish provinces of the southeast are 2.5 or 3. I was involved with a project at Defense Department a dozen years ago where we concluded that no matter what Turkey did, a majority of military-age residents of Turkey would be from Kurdish-speaking families. Turkey's nightmare is an independent Kurdish state which would break up the Turkish state. And a collapse of territorial integrity of Syria would probably give rise to a Kurdish state, because you know the Kurds are distributed between Syria, Iraq, Iran, and what's the fourth? It's the Turkey, right? Of course, Turkey. So you have a strong potential for the breakup of Turkey, and I think this was a defensive and reactive action by the Turks, not necessarily a nice or creditable one, but defensive as opposed to a neo-Ottoman ideological initiative. Turkey's other problem is that the majority of Turkic peoples will be outside Anatolia within 20 or 30 years because the population of the Turkish former Soviet socialist republics is growing rapidly. And if Turkey wants to be relevant, it has to reach out to them, and it can't do that for geographic reasons without infrastructure, and it can't get the infrastructure without China. So China, Russia, and Turkey, and even India, have a common interest in stabilizing that part of the world, which is both economic, geographic, as well as geopolitical. So I think it's a very different situation from India and Pakistan, where you have a religious rivalry. I really don't understand what happened with the terrorist attack in the Kashmir and the responses, not an area of my expertise. It's regrettable, and I was very pleased to see President Trump's statement overnight that American mediation was helpful in getting a ceasefire. I don't know what happened, but I certainly hope that the United States plays such a stabilizing role and reduces the risk of war by nuclear powers over such issues.
So having started with the global perspective, we are now closing in on our immediate neighborhood. And the first issue that comes to my mind, speaking on the shores of Lake Balaton in Hungary, with Ukraine being our immediate neighbor, is to inquire how you see the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine. We were quite optimistic in late January and early February. Now it seems that this is going to be making peace in Ukraine is going to be a more complicated project. David, how you see the Trump administration's efforts in this regard? Does the administration have other cards to play with Ukraine or with Russia?
I'm sure the administration has many cards to play. I won't guess specifically at what they are, but the immediate problem is the spoilers in Europe, which is Starmer, Macron, and Merz. To the extent that the Russians see the Germans preparing to spend €1 trillion on rearming and committed to keeping the war going in Ukraine, that is a major issue for the Russians. And it certainly makes the efforts of the Trump administration a great deal more difficult. I think that Hungary has played an exemplary role in trying to establish a dialogue between Russia and the West, and to a great extent this has been sabotaged by Friedrich Merz and Keir Starmer. That's a real problem. So getting around this is going to be diplomatically difficult. I don't know, I'm not in position to tell you what the administration might do. I think there are many tools at its disposal, but obviously it's difficult. From the Russian standpoint, the last time they put forward Minsk II as a peace formula, as Angela Merkel said in her memoirs, it was simply used to buy time to rearm Ukraine. So there's a trust issue. I don't think these are insuperable, but they're difficult.
Philip, you mentioned that the Russian-Ukraine war was the most serious one could get to a potential World War III scenario, but downplayed the possibility of one. What's your take on what's going on in Ukraine now?
I think what's really important to understand is that the vast majority of what's being reported in English language and European media is just fake. It's just spin from the Europeans and the Brits and so on. They've come up with this ceasefire thing, which they know the Russians aren't going to adhere to because it's just 30 days for Ukraine to like rearm, to do all that. So they knew that the ceasefire thing was a non-starter. They knew that the ceasefire meme, as you might call it, was sounded good. It sounded like they were trying to make progress. So they've kind of thrown this in to gum up the works. But they think they're being important, but they're not. The reality is that the Americans haven't changed their position at all since January. They've certainly found that the Russians aren't really interested in doing any sort of a deal that will disadvantage them. But my sense is that the Trump administration are just waiting for the current weapons package to run out. It runs out in the next couple of weeks. That weapons package was put together at the end of the Biden administration as kind of a holdover for the Ukrainian military. I think at the same time, there's pretty clear evidence that the Russians are gearing up for a summer offensive, which could be the big push. We don't know. It's impossible to predict these things, but certainly those are the forces at work. When that weapons package runs out, could the Trump administration really turn around and put together another one? I mean, that would be the biggest loss of face, rather than any sort of loss of a war, to my mind. The MAGA people would go absolutely crazy. I can't see how JD Vance would sell that. So I think I think nothing's changed. I think we're just living in this phony war period, as they used to call it at the beginning of the Second World War, where there's a weapons package that's there. It's drip, 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 feeding the weapons in. It runs out very soon. The Russians are gearing up for an offensive, and the Europeans are manipulating their media machine because it's all they can do, and then they think that they're doing something important, but they're not.
Of course, one element of this story is the project that one may call the accelerated accession of Ukraine into the European Union as a sort of palliative for Ukraine in exchange for losing the war. How do you see that impacting the European Union? Is the EU project going to be viable in its current form if it happens and once it happens? And of course, we're hearing from the current Commission President 2030 as a target date. I just cannot imagine how that may look like for Hungarian agriculture, for example, or for French agriculture for that matter. But I don't hear the French political class revolting against it for some reason. What do you think the reason for that is? David?
I'll defer to Philip.
Philip, you're the European here, so.
Yeah, and at MKE we did the study on the effects of the Ukrainian accession. I think the headline numbers we came up, I'm doing it off the top of my head, was something like 4 million forint a person in Hungary to pay for everything, and that's just the distributed share. You know, if we distribute it by population and GDP, and I think the end cost was something like 13 times the current EU Commission budget. So when you look at numbers like that just make absolutely no sense, I think it's pretty obvious what a Ukrainian accession will do to the EU. It'll destroy it, and that's precisely what the Hungarian government's position is on this. That if you do this, you will destroy the European Union. And so then you just have to ask yourself: number one, are they bluffing? I don't think they are. I think these are pretty wacky people. And then number two, as the ramifications of that become increasingly clear, will they be able to put it over the line? I mean, I just highlight one aspect that's non-economic, right? Because the economic aspects are just absolutely grim. But just just to highlight the security aspect of this. So if the Ukraine is ceded to the EU, you'd have a country that's full of arms, right? Not just AK-47s. We're talking about surface-to-air missiles, which can interfere with commercial air travel if they get into the wrong hands. So you could shut down, in theory, if terrorists got their hands on a bunch of SAMs in Ukraine, they could shut down European air travel, in a sense. Okay, you also have an incredibly porous border, which you can get in because presumably people will want to make money and they'll put people in. I mean, it's a jihadi's dream, right? You can literally come in easily through this border, bribe somebody, buy an SAM, and then just like drive it across Europe. I mean, the security concerns alone here are absolutely abysmal. So I think the real question is, as reality bites with the Europeans and they actually start to see what this would actually mean, even beyond the economics, because these people are clearly really into printing money. That's been shown very clearly. But when they think about the security ramifications and so on, will they dial it back? I think that's the only question. But in terms of intent right now, I think they're serious about it.
Why are they doing it? If this is so self-destructive, if one tries to come up with a rational response, it's very hard to find one without suggesting that there must be some sort of master plan behind this. David, what's your take on this?
I think if you read George Orwell's 1984 with the description of perpetual war organized by wicked elites, you have a very accurate picture of what's going on now. I believe that the liberal globalist neoconservative elites in Washington and London in particular, and their friends like Merz in Germany, want to keep the war going as a way of exercising political control. In the case of some of the neoconservatives, there really is an ideological commitment to the idea that American-style democracy is a universal medicine which fixes everyone's problems. As crazy as that sounds, you have to know them to understand how crazy they can be. But there's an element of pure manipulation involved, which I think is extremely dangerous and malicious.
Let's have a look at the European political class now. Having studied the intent behind Ukrainian accession, and there's been a couple of months ago there were elections in Germany. We have a new German chancellor for the second time. He managed to be voted in confidence. There are going to be elections in France in 2 years' time. But one of the candidates is probably not running. The most likely winner is not running for legal reasons, to put it in a diplomatic way. So what's your take, Philip, on the European political class? And I'm asking you in particular because in one of your podcasts a couple of weeks ago, you said that Europe's political class is completely finished and regime change is coming. In practical terms, how are we supposed to imagine that? What's going to happen?
Well, I think it speaks to what you just asked about the intent behind the Ukraine war, whether there's a master plan or not. No, what's happening here is that over the past 20 years, for whatever reason, I'm sure historians will study this, European leaders became vassals of a Democrat Party liberal elite in DC. They became outright vassals. They were not vassals during the Iraq War. They were able to take an independent position away from the Americans. They have not been able to do that in the current generation. Now what's happened is, as America often does when it pulls out of a conflict zone, it's cut its vassals off. And now they have no leadership. They're completely directionless. And what we're seeing actually with this kind of collapse of democracy, which is what it is in many European countries, is a collapse of their regime, in a sense, of the globalist liberal regime that was kind of always there post-1990, but it kind of went into its kind of final mode with these ultra vassals, in a sense, in the previous generation. And I think that the sort of regime change that we're going to see here is going to be as profound as what you saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think that many of the people that are embedded in various state infrastructure, NGO infrastructure, and so on, will just start to melt away. The funding's already stopping. You know, it's already drying up with USAID and so on. And I know, I absolutely agree with the Hungarian government that we should have serious military expenditure at a national level. But the package that's been put together for Merz, let's call a spade a spade. This is to keep the money flowing. The NATO money is leaving, and they need to keep the money flowing because everyone needs jobs. But Europe's going broke. They can't afford any of this. So it's a leadership class that was increasingly vassalized over time. Its master has walked away. By the way, Kamala Harris would have walked away too. She would have just been more polite about it. This is just consistent theme in American strategy. She would have walked away too. You don't see a big issue currently on the anti-Trump side that we really need to get our European friends back. Nobody cares anymore in America. So they've walked away. The European political class are trying to cling on for dear life. They see Ukraine as an existential issue for them, rightly or wrongly, probably a mix of both. And they're trying to use the remilitarization push to to fill in the gap that's been brought open for funding and so on from the collapse of their global networks.
David, you've been studying Germany for some time. Hungary is obviously greatly exposed in economic terms to Germany. It has been for many years throughout our history. And increasingly so since the democratic transition. Hungary is a sort of backyard for German industry in many ways. And this seemed to be a successful strategy for a long time. However, there are now lingering doubts about it, whether the German economic and political model is actually functioning, able to function or survive even. Do you think there's going to be a turnaround with the loosening of their economic strings and budgetary strings, or this is just a false assumption and we're drifting into somewhere else here?
Well, Hungary, I think, is first in the world in terms of foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP, which is a remarkable accomplishment. It created a lot of very good jobs for a lot of Hungarians. So that's a success on the part of Fidesz. But if you look into the future, it's clear that manufacturing is undergoing a fundamental change, as big as the change, say, in agriculture during the 19th century with its mechanization, the application of artificial intelligence, high-speed data, and other technologies to manufacturing will reduce the need for labor enormously. So I think Hungary's future economically will be more in high-tech areas and less incrementally in traditional manufacturing. I have the honor to serve on the advisory board to the Hungarian Research Network, which is devoted to promoting exactly these things, and I think this is well understood by the government, and you have a certain amount of time in which to adapt to this transition. Now, Germany is an anomaly because the most popular party is the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a populist party, very much in sync with the thinking of Fidesz. Of course, Alice Weidel, several weeks ago, visited Budapest at a joint press conference with your prime minister, and I think that shows the potential for an agreement of patriotic parties in Central Europe, Germany and Central Europe. On the other hand, the current government, current chancellor, who is a minority chancellor, lost his first bid to be elected as chancellor in the German parliament, in the Bundestag, is quite hostile. So it's a very difficult situation to maneuver, and I can't advise you as to how to deal with it tactically. I think it'll be a difficult situation to traverse, but if you look at the trends, the fact that AfD is the most popular party in Germany should be a very encouraging signal.
David basically answered my last question, which pertains to Hungary. So I turn to Philip now. So we have arrived to the last point of our discussion. What conclusions can Hungary draw from all this, from the G2 rivalry, from middle powers, exercising their room for maneuver, from European turmoil, collapse of the European political class? What lessons are to be drawn for Hungary? Both of you have been living here for some time. You have an understanding to some degree of what we are doing. So what would be your advice for the way ahead in this whirlpool?
I think the government's way ahead of any other European government in terms of, you know, having the Eastern opening and so on. I think that's very wise. I think it's a good strategy. I think maintaining friendly relations with your neighbours is always a good strategy. They've achieved that. I think currently the government's probably preparing the way for the inevitable trade corridors through Central Asia into, you know, the Balkans, Central and Eastern Europe, and so on. I'd really like to see that turn into a more Central European project. As I said earlier, I think the multipolar world is basically a reversion to civilizational norms. And okay, maybe that doesn't mean bringing back the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but you know, those countries have an awful lot in common historically and so on. And it could be a very powerful European bloc, economic bloc, trading bloc, and so on. So I think that's really the direction that Hungary should go in terms of its strategy. But I think there's already some signs that there's some desire to do that. The other thing that I'd highlight that I don't think is being thought about enough here is the advantage that Hungary might have in energy. Europe is shutting itself off from energy, both through its green madness and through its sanctions policies and so on with Russia. Now, look, the Nord Stream will eventually be turned back on. It's a necessity, so it will happen. What can't go on won't go on is the kind of iron law in economics. They will turn it back on, but the reality is that Germany have shown themselves now to be a very unreliable trade partner in energy. Hungary have two advantages here because they don't have any natural advantages in Hungary because, I mean, there's a little bit of gas here and there, but it's not a big oil power or anything like that. But the two advantages it does have are geographic. This could be a real, really good place as an energy hub. It has refining capacity with MOL and so on. So I think that's worth looking into. But the other thing that I think is underappreciated, I'm not saying it's fully underappreciated, I know there's investment in it and so on, but is the nuclear capacity of Hungary. It's very unusual to have a country that's this small that has the capacity to produce nuclear power. I'm originally from Ireland, which is about half the size of Hungary, and if Ireland had to get a nuclear program underway, they'd have to start from scratch with regulation, training engineers, all of that. It's doable. I'm not saying it's doable, but it's not easy. Hungary have an enormous advantage there, which I think they should take advantage of. I think that it should be building much more in the way of nuclear power. I think they should ignore these promises being laid out by renewables. I'm not saying renewables have no place, but nuclear power is just one of the most certain of anything. You'll probably have to go with Russian or Chinese because it's the only stuff that's affordable. The Western stuff just isn't affordable. That includes the French, and it's never built on time, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you did that, that would both be a massive economic boom because people are always going to need energy, and it would give the country massive geopolitical leverage. I mean, just think about in the recent dispute with Ukraine over the oil shipments, Hungary was able to play the electricity card. Imagine that times 10.
I think Hungary's greatest resource is Hungarians. Speaking as an American, we remember vividly that the atom bomb was invented by Wigner, Teller, von Neumann, Szilard. Our computer science industry was created by John von Neumann. The Strategic Defense Initiative was the inspiration of Edward Teller. The influence of Hungarian scientists, mathematicians, artists, musicians in the United States has been enormous. I think your biggest single problem, putting all these things aside, is your brain drain, your ability to retain many of your most talented young people. I've published this, so it's nothing new to say, but I think if Hungary can muster its intellectual resources and build on the extraordinary talent that this country has manifested in the past and persuade its most talented young people to stay here and build the country rather than pursue higher salaries in Berlin or Vienna, you'll do extraordinary things.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. We are running out of time, but we may have one question, time for one question from the audience, if there's one. Is there anyone who would like to? If this is not the case, then thank you so much for both of you. It's been a pleasure.